morning, church. There, it's good to be with you today. It's been kind of a stressful week in some ways, and I actually have I'm really sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation that's very advanced for you today. I was working on it, and I actually have live video of my process of working with my PowerPoint this week. This is a live video. I don't know how we caught it. We caught it somehow. But this is, this was, I don't know, this is maybe Tuesday, and then we came to Wednesday, and just kind of working through, and So that's kind of how it went this week with PowerPoint. But it's great to be with you, and I'm glad to share that confession with you of how that went. We are working through a series called Anxious, and we're talking about worry and anxiety and stress. And kind of the goal, at least for me in sharing this, is that we might have some more empathy for ourselves, have more empathy and understanding for each other. We might have some ways of better coping and making our way through this crazy world that we live in. So that's kind of my hope. And I wanted to share a disclaimer at the beginning of the sermon, one that I shared last week. I wanted to reiterate that. And that's that this series, throughout, I'm going to use the words anxiety and anxious in a colloquial sense. So I'm using them to kind of refer to the experiences of being worried, of having apprehension, of being on edge, of being nervous, etc. Are you with me? So I'm using those in the colloquial sense. So as in, I'm worried about the big speech that I have coming up, or I'm nervous about my house sale or purchase that's on its way, or I'm apprehensive that my kids have a new school and daycare situation, or I'm on edge about a new job, or I'm worried about earthquakes, or I feel stressed about not getting enough sleep or enough exercise or enough good, those are all kind of strangely familiar, aren't they? Maybe we'll share some other categories that are shared beyond just me. But I wanted to share this disclaimer as I use the word anxiety, because I know that there are other ways that we use that word, and oftentimes we use anxiety to talk about it in a clinical sense. We talk about anxiety disorders. Where people, and many of us in this room, feel crippling or overwhelming or sometimes constant responses to sometimes to everyday stuff that just overwhelms our lives. There's a couple different ways that we use those words, anxious and anxiety. And so I just want to reiterate, I would hate to somehow communicate to any of us here in this room who suffer from more clinical anxiety. I'd hate to communicate that somehow that I somehow think you should feel ashamed or stigmatized, or that any of us should feel bad about seeking medical treatment, or maybe being on medication, or seeing a therapist. Like, I don't think any of us should feel bad about looking for ways to try to help cope with life and be more healthy. So if for you have a more serious form, and for whatever, because of that, Pastor Chris's quick tips about dealing with being worried aren't cutting it. I don't think any of us should feel stigmatized or embarrassed about that. And so as we're working through, I just wanted to kind of throw that disclaimer out. And it may be that what we're talking about is useful to everyone across the board, but what I'm aiming at is kind of the lowest common denominator, the human experience that we all have of being nervous or worried or anxious and so on. So where we've been and where we're going. Last week we defined this a little bit about where worry comes from. I talked a little bit about how we all have an inner safety officer that looks out for us and tries to guard us when a bear is chasing us, or when there's an earthquake, or when we have a speech, or when a friend is mad at us, or whatever. And we talked about how different people have different sensitivities, right? Some of us are very sensitive to that in this room, and some of us are not as sensitive to that in this room, and that some of that has to do with personality. But our worry is often not in incoherent, that worry is just this chronic thing that sticks with us. And so we close with looking at John chapter 13, where Jesus encourages his disciples who were feeling anxious in a certain situation. And he encouraged them with a strategy that I've found helpful, which is looking at and affirming the deep and abiding truths about my identity. And for me, this is incredibly useful. I have meaning in my life. God made me. I belong. I'm loved exactly as I am. So that's where we've been. We've kind of looked at what is worry, what is anxiety. And today we're going to pick up kind of where we left off and ask the question, what do we do when we're anxious or worried or stressed out? So when we have that speech coming up, or our business isn't going as well as we had hoped, or we have a test that's around the corner, or there's world events and we're concerned about what's happening in our community, or we have conflict in relationships, or we're worried about making ends meet financially, or we have childcare stuff, or we just have little children, which creates anxiety on its own, at least in my experience, or we have health uncertainties, or whatever life is throwing us at the time. What do we do? What are some ways to manage that worry? How do we cope? And in my life, in my experience, there's two sort of ends of a spectrum. There are helpful ways of coping and not so helpful ways of coping. And at least in my life, I've experimented with both of those a lot, and maybe some of you are the same. And I had a therapist that used to talk about constructive and deconstructive coping mechanisms. So there's all kinds of stuff that we can do to deal with it, but some of them tend to make our lives better, and some of them tend to make our lives worse. Are you with me? Are you with me? So as I've been down here in California, for example, about 2 different methods of doing things, I've noticed that you all drive a little differently than we do in College Place, Washington, just outside of Walla. And I saw this video of a guy sort of demonstrating how you guys do it down here. And it gives me anxiety just to watch And I found out that this is legal. It's not like it's a wrong thing. People do this, and sorry, I hope that I'm not changing anyone. And just a spoiler, this goes on for like 10 minutes, and the person survives. Just so you don't want to carry on. But there are often 2 different ways. There's the constructive way of driving, which is what we do in College Place, and then there's this. Yeah? All right? So today I want to share 2 couplets, all right? I'm going to share 2 pairs of ways that we deal sometimes with anxiety. And in each of those pairs, there's sort of a constructive, helpful version, and then a not-so-helpful, deconstructive version. Are you with me? So we're going to look at 2 pairs. And of course, there are millions of different ways we all deal with it, and I'm going to try to make this sermon under an hour long. So we're just going to look at 2 pairs, right? We're just going to look at 2 pairs today. And these have been relevant and useful to me, or at least relevant in my life, and I hope they'll be helpful to you as well. So we sang a song just a moment ago, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and that's one that I'm glad we sang it. I mentioned it to Carrie as we were talking about this series in the service, and I said, man, that would be a perfect song for us to sing on this week. So thanks to Julio. I don't know where you went, but thank you for leading us in that. I appreciate it. But and I wanted us to sing it because there's one line, well, there's more than one reason I wanted to sing it, but there's one line in this song that sticks in my craw. You guys heard that saying before? Stick in your craw. It's about birds. It originated with birds. Anyway, there's one line in that song that just really grates at me, and it's the line that says, we should never be discouraged. Is there anyone else here who that line annoys you or has annoyed you at some point? There's a few of us that you're with me. Like that, we should never be. It just rubs me the wrong way. I remember one time I was in church and on a Sabbath morning, and we were singing that song in the congregation, and I glanced across the room, and I noticed a friend whose marriage was falling apart, and he was singing that song, We Should Never Be Discouraged. And then I looked around, and I saw another person whose spouse was undergoing treatment for cancer, and they were singing, "We should never be discouraged." And then I saw another person who was up near the front who had just been asked to leave classes in college, had asked to leave the school, and they were singing, "We should never be discouraged." And I wondered to myself, why should they not be discouraged? It's a pretty high expectation. And I love the overall message of the song, right? I love the message of the song, and I completely agree with this premise that Jesus is with us, that he's our friend, that he cares about us, that he's present with us, that our prayers matter. I completely agree with the premise of the song, but there's just that line that strikes me as off. We should never be discouraged. And it might be that I'm hypercritical, and it might be that I'm oversensitive, and it might be that the author of the song meant something completely different than how I'm taking it, and I accept all of that. I don't know. But I do know that I personally have experienced at least one strain of religious practice that teaches sort of something similar to this, something similar to this surface level, that essentially we Christians, we should never be discouraged, and if we are, we're doing it wrong. That if I ever feel that way, it's because there's something wrong with me, and maybe even I'm sinning. I went to a men's conference once that kind of was an expression of that sort of strain of religious thought. And the attendees in the conference, we were all taught together that we should be very, very skeptical of our emotions, that we should be wary of them. And we were taught this mantra that we kind of repeated multiple times all throughout the weekend. My feelings aren't real, they're just here to trick me. And they would make us say, like we all said this thing together. And I was really uncomfortable with it. And sort of the implication of the entire thing is that if you're anxious or you're ashamed or you're angry, if you're feeling stuff that's unpleasant, there's something wrong with you, and you're broken and you're sinning. And it sort of had the energy of suck it up, buttercup. All right, you guys familiar with suck it up, buttercup? It's sort of like this, quit being a baby. And in my experience, moralizing or putting value judgment on any part of our emotional experience, it isn't generally helpful. And for me, it hasn't been helpful with dealing with worry. In my experience, if I'm judging my worry as somehow being unspiritual or sinful, it tends to lead me to repress it and pretend like it's not there or deny that it's there. And then for me, at least, when I sort of pretend like my worry's not there at all, then, man, talk about driving the ship, right? Or talk about driving from the back seat. Then that's the thing that's controlling my life. And so I end up with a whole group of people. I think if we live in this culture, we can end up with a whole group of people, like a whole men's conference of people who are sad and anxious and scared and afraid and worried, but who are all pretending like everything is just fine. And they're all projecting their stuff everywhere. So I think that sort of moralizing our anxiety and saying, well, I shouldn't ever be discouraged, so I'm a bad person if I feel worried. And I think an alternative model, it's one that's demonstrated and illustrated in the Psalms, amongst many other places, but I think especially in the Psalms. The Psalms in the Scriptures, the book right in the middle. Like if you open up a Bible in the pew, if you aren't familiar, it's right in the middle. Chances are, if you let the thing drop open, and it's the biggest book in the Bible, 150, 160 some odd chapters, and they're poem after poem, song after song after song, illustrating and discussing the full gamut of human experience. There are Psalms that are about anger and rage. There are songs that express murderous intent, right? There are all kinds of stuff. There are songs about lament and sadness and loss, and there's psalms about awe and wonder and joy and happiness and thrill. There's psalms about shame and guilt. There's psalms about courage and trust, and there's songs of great anxiety and worry and stress. They're all through the songs. That's what the book is about. It's songs of what it looks like to live a spiritual life, to wrestle with God in real life. And one of the things about the Psalms that I love so much is that it's not a book of us telling us you should never feel discouraged. It's a book of the people writing the Psalms who are expressing these very things to God. And I had this great slide where I actually listed out, you go to Psalm 88 and find about anger, and you go to Psalm 10 and read some about fear. You could go through. I had a whole list of them for you. I had a very elegant slide, but I don't have it here. But I think that the lesson here is that I don't think that emotion is good or bad. Surely some of it's pleasant or unpleasant, but I don't think it's good or bad. And I think at its core, I think emotion is information. It is what it says. It might be true information, or it might be misleading information. It might not be exactly accurate. It might be disproportionate to the situation, but it is what it is. And I think if we're curious about it, we can learn something about ourselves. And so I think when dealing with worry in our lives, when dealing with feelings of anxiety or feeling anxious or feeling stressed, I think rather than making value judgments about this, I should not be worried. I'm so upset with myself that I feel this way. Instead of making value judgments, I think maybe a better tactic is to follow that of the psalmist. Name it. Own it. Maybe verbalize it. And obviously there are limits to this strategy, and for those of us who've gone through periods of clinical anxiety, we know that naming it can kind of lead you into a negative cycle, and so there are limits to this strategy. But for me, in my experience, more often than not, when I talk about this stuff, it loses its power over me. All of us, it's amazing. It's a beautiful and amazing dynamic. And so sometimes acknowledging it means going to a therapist, spending time in counseling and confronting it and acknowledging and looking at it. Sometimes it might mean analyzing it, trying to figure it out, being a detective. Sometimes it might be confronting it, challenging it, right? It can look like other times it might just being stop, saying hello to it, breathing deeply. Interesting. Some of us have found that talking to friends, people that we can trust, people that aren't going to try to give us advice or try to tell us what to do. Some of us create art and write music. Thanks, John, wherever you are. Some of us write poetry. Some of us write it down. It might even be for some of us. It might be that for some of us that the hymn that I mentioned at the beginning of this section is useful as we take everything to God in prayer, right? Even that anxiety, even that stress. So that's the first couplet. Are you with me? There's one impulse we can moralize our worry and kind of shame ourselves for it, and there's another kind of angle where we express it and own it and are honest with it. All right, so that's one couplet, a couple of different options. One's not so helpful, one, in my judgment, is super helpful. Now for the second couplet of options this morning, and for that I want to go to the book of Exodus. I love this story in Exodus chapter 16. And so just to give you a little background, if any of you are not familiar with the story, the book of Exodus is the story about the children of Israel, the Israelites making their way out of slavery in Egypt into freedom, right? So this people, this group, the Jewish people, they've been slaves for 400 or 500 years, and the narrative reads that they call out to God for deliverance, and he hears them, and he sends a deliverer, and through a series of miraculous and amazing events, and through this leader, Moses, he leads them out of Egypt and into the promised land. And those of us who are familiar with this story, we know that before they get to the promised land, there's this period, right? There's this sort of hiccup period, and it's 40 years they spend in what was called the wilderness. They spend 40 years in the wilderness. So they're out of slavery, everything's great, but then there's sort of this waiting period, and they're in the desert, and they're hanging out, and it's uncomfortable, and they're not enjoying themselves. And here they are, they're this people who have gone through trauma for generations. They've suffered, and now they're out in discomfort. discomfort, and they're stressed, and they're exposed, and they're worried, and they're anxious, and you kind of get where I'm going, right? This is this people. They're out in the desert. They don't have enough water. They don't have enough food. And in Exodus chapter 16, they begin complaining. Yeah? I want to read from verse 3. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out here in the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." They begin complaining, "We want to go back. We want to go back." And I think that there's a way in which we can relate to our anxiety, and I think this is super common, where we run away from it. I think one way some of us cope is to run away, is to try to go back to Egypt, if you will. When I was 18, I went through an experience that changed my life, and some of you have shared with you. We had a fire in my house, and my brother, who was 12, was killed. And I'll share more about that as we get to know each other more. And of course, it was profoundly traumatic. And I have many ways that experience affects me still to this day. One of the things that I noticed or that I saw in that experience as an 18-year-old was I was amazed at how the church came around me and my family, as church does, right? They surrounded us and looked after us. And there were people who showed up and took care of practical things, and there were people who randomly were mowing the lawn, and they were doing dishes, and people were coming and stealing our laundry, and it would come back folded and cleaned, and the food, just mountains and mountains of food was constant, just all kinds. It's the stuff that we do as a church when people are in pain. Yeah, are you with me? It's the stuff we just practical. You can't do anything to help the situation. How do you help that? There's nothing you can do. But we're present when we love, and we do practical things. And people showed up, like I said, with just mountains and mountains of food. And one of the things that I learned, one of the things that I practiced in that experience that kind of solidified over the years is that I learned that I could run away from those feelings. I could run away from that fear, from the trauma, from the anxiety, from the loss, from the sad. I could run away from it just a little bit by medicating it with food. And there's no blame on anyone. Like, it's the right thing to bring casseroles. It totally is. But what I learned is in some small way, I could lessen, you with me? I could lessen that anxiety with Ben and Jerry, my friends, right? They'd come and help me, and it would kind of go down a little bit, right? And of course, we can medicate and we can run away from our anxiety using all kinds of stuff, right? It's not just food. That's just my choice. But we could use procrastination and Netflix and success and achievement and I'm better than you. Some of us use drugs or alcohol to kind of check out, or cigarettes or shopping or sexuality. I mean, the list goes on and on. It can be good things or bad. Some of us use adrenaline. Some of us use entertainment, video games. Some of us even use religion. Being right makes you feel really good, and being right can help us deal with a lot of anxiety. And it's funny, a lot of this stuff, I don't think it's necessarily bad. There's nothing wrong intrinsically with food, right? It's not that these things are bad. It's that they're unhelpful for coping with worry. They're ways of running away from what's going on in our lives. It's sort of like the children of Israel. They're in the desert. We want to go back to Egypt. We don't like this discomfort. We don't like how this feels. So let's go back to the story. Exodus chapter 16, the next verse, verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." I love this story. So God hears them yet again, and he responds, and he rains this bread down from heaven. And again, if you're not familiar with the story, it's this stuff called manna. Manna is this, food that appears every day, and they mash it and turn it into bread and stuff. And there's some scholars that say that manna is a transliteration of the Semitic word for "what is it?" So literally manna is, well, what is this stuff? So they made food out of it. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard it said many times. And this manna had really, really interesting properties. Like I said, it would show up every day for them consistently. But one of the properties was that everyone was supposed to collect a certain amount. It was like a quart or something. For everyone in your household, collect an amount. And it had this property of if you collected too much, you had enough. And if you didn't collect enough, you had enough. No matter how much you collected every day, you had enough. But then if people tried to hoard it, if people were really, really anxious and they tried to take care of themselves and take care of the situation, what would happen? It would rot overnight. And so even for people who were super crafty and super on it and they were going to look after themselves, nope, can't do it. You have enough for today and today only. And as I was reading this week on some of the commentators about it, there's all kind of sort of potential naturalistic explanations. But the third property of the manna is sort of it's random, it's arbitrary. There's no way really to explain it, and that was with the Sabbath deal, right? So there's this added twist where God says, "Listen, on Friday, all evidence to the contrary. On Friday, go ahead and hoard some, and take double. And Friday, they're just I know that it's not worked all week long. I know that if you take an extra all week long, it's rotted. But on Friday, take double, and just trust me, it's going to last through until Sunday. It's going to work out." And so that was the third property. And I don't think that there's anything magical about Friday or Sabbath. It's arbitrary in a sense. God just said it. Treat this day differently. There's something different about it. And all the rules that they knew were out the window. And all evidence to the contrary, they were supposed to do this other thing. And here's where I'm going with this. One option for coping with our anxiety is to run away. It's to hide in whatever it happens to be that we like to hide in. And we all like to hide in different stuff, whether it's food or alcohol or consumerism or whatever. We all hide. So one temptation, one potential coping mechanism is to hide. And it kind of works in some ways, right? If it didn't work at all, we wouldn't do it at all. Somehow there's a part of it that works. So there's one option. We can go back to Egypt. But another option is to lean in. Another option is to lean in to that worry, to lean in to that stress, to lean into the thing that we're afraid of. And I think it's possible, in fact, to use the practice of Sabbath keeping as a means, as a very practical means of practicing trust with God. So here's one way that it looks in my life. I sometimes get worried and apprehensive and anxious and stressed about writing sermons. It doesn't always come together the way I go. Sometimes my PowerPoint presentation doesn't work out. Sometimes I get stressed about that. But I have had a practice over the years, a practice that I generally keep, and that's that when Friday evening, 4 or 5 o'clock comes, I just quit prepping. Just stop. Whether it's ready or not, whether the PowerPoint is ready or not, I just stop. And for me, it's as someone who is on the platform on Sabbath and has sort of a unique nature of work when it comes to Sabbath mornings, for me, it's a very, very intentional, practical way of exercising that trust. It's my way of collecting extra manna. Are you with me? Now, it's not somehow sinful to prepare for sermon. I'm not judging anyone, but for me, it's a very intentional choice of I want to have an expression of trust on Sabbath. And so it's something that I generally try to do. And I want my sermons to be helpful. I want them to be useful. I want it to be good. I have self-doubt rattling around, but whatever. It's a moment to stop, to trust that it's all going to work out. So I pray. God's got this. It's going to come together. He's going to work out for me. And for me, this is little. This is super tiny thing. But for me, there's a little bit of an edge of defiance to it. No, I'm not going to work myself to the bone. This anxiety is not going to rule my life. I'm going to hold it up. And so I use this beautiful practice of Sabbath to leverage my anxiousness into an opportunity to lean in to my worry and trust instead of running away. So for you, it might look totally different in your life. It might be, I'm afraid of getting a bad grade. right? I'm afraid, I'm worried about this test. I've been preparing my whole life. I've gone to school for 16 years. I don't know how many years you all that go to the university down the road go to school, but it's a lot of years. I've been going to school for 1,000,000 years, and I have to take this test, and if I don't pass this test, then it's all for naught, right? So there's some worry, yeah? So I'm worried about this thing that's coming up and so on, right? And so Sabbath presents as an opportunity, all evidence to the contrary, because I need as much time to prepare for that exam as possible, Sabbath presents as an opportunity to stop and not study at all. That's an act of trust. Not hoard, not try to take care of, but lean into that worry and trust that God is with us all along the way. It might be, for some of us, we're stressed and worried and anxious about making ends meet. It might be for some of us we have bills that got to get paid. And so Sabbath might present as an opportunity, evidence to the contrary, to say no to that overtime shift, to not go in on that extra job, to say no to that extra contract. Are you with me? This is the real deal, right? That's trust. I'm going to trust God. He's got me through thick times and lean times. I'm going to lean into trust instead of trying to cope. Or here's another one. I'm stressed about this friendship that I have. I really want to make friends, and I feel lonely, and I don't feel connected. I feel really, really stressed. And so I'm going to take Sabbath, evidence to the contrary. I'm going to take Sabbath. I'm going to spend the day in solitude. Spend it by myself. I'm going to take time and spend time with just me and God. And sure, there might be all kinds of more intense experiences that we go to in life that really this exercise has limited relevancy to. I know that some of us are going through stress and anxious that is more persistent and more insistent. Some of us here are going through serious illnesses. Our kids are in crisis. You have kids. For some of us, we're going through the experience of losing someone we love. And so for some of us, just getting out of bed is an exercise of trust. Some of you are with me there. And it might be that for some of us, just filling those Sabbath hours by remembering the words of that song, bringing everything to God in prayer. There's a line from Barbara Brown Taylor that I love. Wisdom is not gained by knowing what is right. Wisdom is gained by practicing what is right and noticing what happens with that practice, whether it succeeds or fails. Anxiety is real for human beings. We all worry. We're all on edge. We all have 1,000,000 balls in the air. I had a professor that says all the time, frequently, he says, it's a hard thing being a human. It's a hard thing being a human being. And whether we like it or not, worry is with us. And we have all kinds of coping mechanisms for dealing with it, and some are helpful and some are not so helpful. Some of us medicate, and some of us ignore it, and some of us moralize it. Others of us embrace it and we lean into it. And some are useful and some are not. And my prayer for us on this Sabbath day is that no matter how we have or continue to relate to our anxieties, that we know deeply that you and I, we are not alone in this. We're walking together in community. We have not been abandoned. And there is more for us yet just around the corner. I want to pray a prayer from one of my favorite theologians who has a book of prayer, Walter Brueggemann. Let's pray this prayer together. It's called Waiting for Bread and God's Future. Father in heaven, we are strange mixtures of loss and hope. As we are able, we submit our losses to you. We know about sickness and dying. We know about death and mortality. We know about failure and disappointment. And now, for just a moment, we do our failing and our dying here in your presence, with you who attend to us in these losses. And as we are able, we submit our hopes to you. We know about self-focused fantasy and notions of control. We also know about futures that are beyond us, held in your good hands. Our hopes are filled with promises of well-being, justice, and mercy. Move us this day, dear Father, beyond our fears and anxieties, into your land of goodness. We wait for your coming. We pray for your kingdom. And in the meantime, please give us bread enough for today. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. Happy Sabbath. See you again.